The storm came down hard on the Wyoming plains, thick snow swallowing the land until even the fences vanished. On Christmas Eve of 1887, the Miller Ranch sat alone in that white wilderness, a forgotten speck miles from the nearest town. The wind screamed through the cracks of the old cabin, shaking loose shutters like angry hands. Inside, a man named Frank Miller sat hunched near a dying fire, staring into embers that barely gave off heat. His hands were rough, scarred by years of work, now pressed together as if prayer alone could warm them. This ranch had once been his pride. It had been proof that a man with faith and hard work could build something lasting in a wild land. But 2 cruel winters, sickness in the cattle, and a failed harvest had stripped it bare. The barn now held only a few weak cows, ribs showing through dull hides. The rest were gone, dead or sold for nothing. Frank felt as empty as the land around him. He looked up at the mantel where a faded photograph rested. It showed a younger Frank standing beside his parents, both smiling with the easy belief of people who trusted God and Christmas miracles. His parents were gone now, buried on a hill not far from the house. Their faith had died with them, or so Frank believed. He had prayed through drought and disease, but the answers never came. Frank rose slowly and walked to the frosted window. Snow spun through the air like smoke, hiding the hills and the trail that led to town. His breath fogged the glass. "Lord," he said quietly, his voice tired and thin, "I've done all I can. If you still remember me, if there's any reason for me to keep this place, give me a sign." The only answer was the crackle of the fire. His eyes drifted to the small Bible on the table. Its leather cover was cracked, pages yellow with age. He had not opened it in months, not since the bank notice arrived warning him his land might soon be taken. With nothing left to lose, he reached for it. The book fell open on its own, landing on a marked page. He read the words slowly. "When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee." His throat tightened. He read it again, feeling something stir deep inside him. Almost belief, almost hope. Then came a sound that did not belong. A knock. Soft, uncertain. Frank froze. No one came out this far in a storm. The knock came again, firmer this time. His heart thudded as he grabbed his lantern and crossed the room. "Who's there?" he called over the wind. "Hope Abbott," a woman's voice answered, trembling but steady. "From the Boston Matrimonial Agency. I'm your bride, Mr. Miller." The word bride hit him like a blow. Months ago, in loneliness and despair, he had written a letter to that agency. He had poured out his failures, his doubts, his fear of dying alone, but he never sent the payment. He had given up on the idea the same week his best cow died in the snow. Frank opened the door and the storm rushed in. Snow swirled around a small woman standing on the porch, clutching a worn leather suitcase. She wore a thin gray shawl and a bonnet dusted with frost. Her cheeks were red from cold, but her blue eyes met his without fear. "You shouldn't be out in this," Frank said, pulling her inside. "The pass is near impossible."
"I walked the last miles," she said, holding her hands near the fire. "The coach broke down."
"They said your ranch was just ahead. I was afraid I came too late." "Too late for what?" he asked. "For you to still want a wife." Frank studied her. She was younger than he expected, but there was something worn in her expression, as if life had tested her and failed to break her. "You best stay the night," he said at last. "Storm's not letting up." Relief washed over her face. "Thank you, Mr. Miller." As she unpacked her few belongings, a Bible, sewing needles, and a small tin box, Frank watched quietly. She moved with calm purpose, rekindling the fire with practiced hands. "You've been letting the flame die," she said gently. "I've been letting everything die," he muttered. She looked back at him. "Then maybe I came just in time." The wind howled outside, but the cabin felt warmer than it had in months. Frank did not know it yet, but the storm had brought more than snow. It had brought the beginning of an answer. Morning came quietly. The storm eased, and pale sunlight crept through the shutters. Frank woke to a smell he had nearly forgotten. Food, real food. The fire roared in the hearth, and a skillet sizzled on the stove. Hope stood there humming a hymn as she cooked. Coffee steamed in a tin pot. Frank sat up slowly, unsure if he was still dreaming. "You're up early," he said. "Old habit," she replied. "I used to teach school. Mornings come easy." They ate together in silence. Before touching her food, Hope bowed her head and prayed. Frank watched her lips move, soft and certain, and something tight in his chest loosened. "You came a long way," he said finally, "for a man who didn't send payment." "I know," she said, "but I read your letter. You wrote about losing more than cattle, about losing faith." He flushed. "That was private. It was honest," she said. "That's why I came." After breakfast, they walked to the barn. Snow glittered in the sunlight. Inside, the cows shivered. One lay weak in the straw, breathing hard. "She's burning up," Hope said, kneeling beside the animal. "Fever," Frank replied. "Can't afford a vet." Hope placed her hand gently on the cow's head. Sometimes care goes further than money. Frank watched her in silence, surprised by her calm. Later that day, they rode into town to register their marriage. The townsfolk stared openly. A stranger woman at Frank Miller's side raised whispers. "Mail order bride," someone muttered. Hope lifted her chin. "A woman's worth isn't measured by what a man owns," she said clearly, "but by what they can build together." That night, back at the cabin, she sat by the fire while Frank worked on a broken chair. "I didn't come here to be kept," she said softly. "I came to help, if you'll let me." Frank looked at her, seeing not weakness but strength shaped by hardship. He nodded once. As he banked the fire that night, watching her rest near the hearth, he whispered into the quiet, "Maybe God ain't done with me yet." Outside, the snow began to fall again, gentle and slow, while inside the Miller cabin, hope took its first breath. The days after Christmas passed in a quiet rhythm that neither Frank nor Hope expected. Each morning, Frank stepped into the cold before dawn, the sky still dark and heavy above the plains. Behind him, the cabin no longer stayed silent. Hope kindled the fire, her movements steady and sure, and soon the smell of warm bread or corn cakes filled the room. The cabin that once felt hollow now carried sound and life. Floorboards creak under two sets of footsteps, and the low murmur of shared work softened the sharp edges of loneliness Frank had carried for years. Frank told himself it was only practical. Another pair of hands meant survival. But he found himself listening for Hope's voice, for the way she hummed old hymns as she worked. Those songs drifted through the cabin like quiet prayers, warming him more than the fire ever could. One morning he found her in the barn with her sleeves rolled up, her skirt brushed with straw. She knelt beside one of the sick cows, rubbing something into its side. The sharp scent of pine and mint filled the air. "What's that you're using?" Frank asked, stepping closer. She looked up, a little startled, then smiled. "A tonic. I learned it years ago. It helps with fever." "You know a lot for a schoolteacher," he said, not unkindly. She paused, her hands still. "I wasn't always a teacher. I worked with a doctor once. He taught me what he could. Said healing starts with care before anything else." Frank watched her work, careful and calm. Something shifted inside him. He had spent months feeling helpless, watching his animals weaken while he could do nothing. Now here was this woman, working as if the outcome still mattered. That afternoon, Hope asked to ride into Sweetwater with him. Frank hesitated. Town had not been kind lately, but he needed supplies, and she wanted to register herself properly. The ride was quiet, the horses' hooves crunching over packed snow. As the town came into view, Frank noticed Hope straighten her shoulders. Inside the general store, heads turned. People whispered, some curious, some cruel. Frank felt his jaw tighten. "She won't last the winter," a woman muttered. Hope pretended not to hear. She picked up a length of cloth and smiled at Frank. "This would brighten the windows, don't you think?" Her calm unsettled the whispers. When they left, Frank spoke low. "You shouldn't have to hear that. People speak from fear, she said. They don't recognize faith when it's still growing. That evening, as they unpacked supplies, Hope stood by the window staring out at the moonlit pasture. Frank sensed something heavy in her silence. "You don't talk much about Kansas," he said gently. She gripped the sill. "I left because I had to. A man there thought he owned everything, including people. When I refused him, he made sure I lost my place, my work, my name." Frank's hands clenched. "You walked into a blizzard to escape that?" "I walked into it to start over," she said. "Your letter spoke of loss without bitterness. I knew a man who still prayed through doubt wasn't truly lost." Frank looked away, shame and gratitude mixing in his chest. "Then maybe you believe enough for both of us," he said quietly. Later that night, he found her asleep near the fire, her Bible open beside her. He read the underlined words about new beginnings and felt something stir that he had not felt in years. As the weeks passed, Hope's quiet work began to show results. The cows stood steadier. One calf that Frank had nearly given up on began to feed again. Hope found moldy hay hidden at the bottom of the storage shed and insisted they burn it. She patched leaks in the barn roof with burlap and tar, humming softly as she worked. "You'll wear yourself out," Frank warned one morning. "I've been tired before," she replied. "This kind of tired feels right." Word began to spread. A neighbor stopped by with a sick mule. Hope hesitated, then helped. Another came with a fevered dog. She never asked for payment. People brought what they could instead: flour, nails, a plank of wood. The ranch began to change. Not fast, but steady, like a wound slowly healing. One Sunday they rode to church together. Frank had not stepped inside in nearly 2 years. The pew creaked beneath his weight. He felt eyes on him, but Hope sat calmly beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The sermon spoke of renewal, of grace found after despair. Frank felt the words settle deep. After the service, a farmer asked if Hope might look at his horse. She glanced at Frank. He nodded. By the time they returned home that evening, Frank understood something he had not dared to hope before. The land was not cursed. It had only been waiting. That night, as they sat by the fire, Hope spoke softly. "I didn't come here to change you, Frank. I came because I believed something good could still grow." He looked at her, seeing strength shaped by pain and kindness. "You've already changed more than you know," he said. Outside, snow fell gently over the plains. Inside, the Miller Ranch held warmth and purpose again, and though Frank did not yet say it aloud, he felt it clearly. Hope had not only saved his ranch, she had begun to save him. Late winter settled over the Wyoming plains, but the Miller Ranch no longer felt buried beneath it. Snow still clung to the edges of the fields and fences, yet beneath the white crust, life stirred. Frank noticed it first in the mornings. The air felt lighter. The silence that once pressed down on his chest had eased. When he stepped outside, he no longer expected failure waiting for him in the barn. One morning, he heard movement before he reached the door. Buckets clanged. A low voice hummed. Frank paused in the barn doorway and stared. Hope worked among the cattle like she had been born there. Her coat hung on a nail, sleeves rolled up, hair loose around her face. The cow he had nearly lost stood on steady legs now, chewing slowly, its eyes clear. "What in the world are you doing?" Frank asked, half in disbelief. "Fixing what was broken," she said simply. The hay was spoiled, damp from the roof. It made them sick. He frowned. "I fed that hay all winter." "It happens," she said gently. "It can be fixed." She mixed oils and herbs she had gathered from the land, rubbing them into swollen joints, cleaning stalls until they smelled of clean straw instead of sickness. Frank watched day after day as strength returned to his herd. Admiration replaced disbelief. He had spent months believing nothing could change. She proved him wrong with quiet patience. Neighbors began to arrive more often, first with cautious questions, then with animals in need: a lame horse, a sick calf, a dog that would not eat. Hope helped each one without asking for payment. In return, people brought what they could: wood for repairs, grain, help mending fences. The ranch no longer felt isolated. It became a place people came to with trust. One evening, Frank found Hope sitting on the fence, watching the cattle graze under a pale sunset. He joined her without speaking. The land stretched wide and calm before them. "You've changed this place," he said at last. She shook her head. "You changed it when you let yourself hope again." Her words settled deep. Frank realized she was right. He had opened the door that Christmas Eve thinking he had nothing left to lose. Instead, he had been given more than he ever asked for. Spring came slowly. Snow melted into streams that ran through the fields. Green pushed up through the soil. Frank repaired the barn roof while Hope painted the porch white. They worked side by side, sharing quiet smiles and small laughter. Sometimes she sang as she worked, and Frank found himself stopping just to listen. One night, as they sat by the fire, Hope grew quiet, her hands twisted in her lap. "There's something you should know," she said. Frank looked up at once. "What is it?" "The man in Kansas," she said softly. "The one I ran from. I don't know if he'll ever come looking, but I needed you to know." Frank rose and stood before her. His voice was firm, steady. "No one's taking you from here. Not him. Not anyone." Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled. "You mean that?" "With everything I've got," he said. She leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. For the first time, it felt right to hold her there. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a whisper of approval. By early spring, the ranch stood transformed. The cattle were healthy, the fences strong. Laughter replaced the heavy silence that once lived there. Frank carved a small wooden sign and placed it by the gate. The words were simple: Hope's Haven. She stood beside him when he set it in place. "You named it after me?" "No," he said. "I named it after what you brought back." A year passed faster than Frank thought possible. Christmas Eve came again, snow falling soft and slow. This time, the storm did not bring fear, it brought memory. Inside the cabin, a small cedar tree stood by the hearth, decorated with ribbons and dried apples. The fire burned bright. Hope kneaded bread at the table while Frank carved wood near the fire. The wind rattled the windows, but neither of them flinched. "Storm's back," Frank said. Hope smiled. "So is Christmas." A sudden knock sounded at the door. Frank opened it to find two men from a nearby ranch, faces pale with worry. A wagon had broken down on the north trail. A woman and her young boy were trapped in the cold. Hope was already reaching for her shawl. "We're going," she said. The journey was hard. Snow cut across the trail, stinging their faces. They found the wagon half buried, the boy hurt and shivering. Hope worked quickly, her hands steady despite the cold. Frank carried the child back through the storm while Hope guided the mother. Back at the ranch, warmth filled the cabin again. The boy slept by the fire, safe. The mother wept with relief. Frank watched Hope clean her hands, exhaustion heavy in her posture, but peace clear in her face. "You saved them," he said quietly. She shook her head. "We did." Later that night, when the storm softened, Frank handed her a small carving. A wooden cross, smooth and simple. "I made it for you," he said, "to remind us." Hope held it carefully, tears shining. "It's beautiful." "So is what you've built here," he replied. She kissed him then, slow and sure, a promise sealed not by words, but by shared storms and steady faith. Another year passed. Christmas morning dawned bright and cold. The Miller Ranch filled with people from Sweetwater Valley. Children laughed. Music played. Pastor Reynolds held a small service in the barn, now warm and decorated with pine. Frank stood beside Hope as the pastor spoke of renewal and quiet miracles. When the crowd asked Frank to speak, he stepped forward, hat in hand. "I nearly gave up," he said simply. "This land, this life. Then God sent someone I didn't expect. She walked through a storm and brought light with her. If you think you're forgotten, remember this place." Sometimes the answer comes as a knock on the door. The crowd fell silent. Hope's eyes filled with tears. As evening came and the guests departed, Frank and Hope stood together beneath falling snow. The sign at the gate caught the last light of day, Hope's Haven. Frank wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "Merry Christmas," he said. She leaned into him, smiling. "Merry Christmas." Inside, the fire burned steady. Outside, the land rested in peace. And in that quiet place where despair once ruled, faith lived again.